The polished brass clock on the wall of the Miles City Mercantile Bank ticked with an indifferent rhythm, each metallic click a small, sharp measure of a future that was about to be born. It was a fine April morning 5 years ago. Sunlight thick and golden poured through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Nate Walker stood at the teller's window, his back straight, his shoulders broad, in his Sunday best. Beside him, Eleanor traced a pattern on the polished oak counter, her fingers delicate, her smile. A private sunbeam meant only for him. "Are you certain, Mr. Walker?" the teller asked, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "That's a considerable sum to carry." Nate nodded, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "We're certain. The Morrison place is up for sale. Best grazing land in the territory." Eleanor squeezed his arm, her eyes shining with the same fierce hope that beat in his own chest. "Our ranch, Nate. Can you believe it?" He couldn't. For years he had worked other men's land, saved every coin, and dreamed of a place to call his own. A place to build a life with her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet-lined box. Inside lay a simple gold band. He had planned to give it to her the moment the deed was signed, to ask her to be his wife under the wide Montana sky on the land that would be theirs. The teller began counting out the bills, his movements slow and precise. The bank was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and lemon polish. A farmer argued softly with a clerk about a loan. A woman hushed her restless child. It was a scene of perfect, ordinary peace. Then the front door burst open, slamming against the wall with a sound like a thunderclap. 3 men stormed in their faces, hidden by dusty bandanas. The leader, a tall man with eyes the color of ice, brandished a Colt Peacemaker. "Nobody move," he bellowed, his voice a raw, grating sound that shattered the morning's calm. Panic erupted. The woman screamed, pulling her child close. The farmer dove behind a desk. The teller's hands shot into the air, scattering a stack of bills that fluttered to the floor like wounded birds. Nate's first instinct was to shield Eleanor. He pushed her behind him, his body a wall between her and the sudden violence. "Stay down," he whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. The robbers moved with brutal efficiency. One vaulted over the counter, stuffing cash into a canvas sack. Another kept his pistol trained on the terrified customers. The leader stalked the center of the room, his movements predatory and sure. His gaze swept over the cowering people, and for a terrifying moment, his icy eyes met Nate's. "You," the leader snarled, pointing the gun at Nate. "The money you just withdrew. Hand it over." Nate's hands tightened into fists. The Morrison place. Their future. It was all there in the thick envelope tucked inside his coat. He hesitated, a fool's defiance rising in his throat. "Nate, please," Eleanor whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. "Just give it to them." Her fear broke his pride. Slowly, he reached inside his coat, his movements measured to avoid spooking the gunman. He pulled out the envelope. As he did, the leader's attention was drawn by a sudden noise from the back office. The bank manager, a portly man with more courage than sense, had emerged with an old shotgun. "Get out of my bank," the manager yelled, his voice cracking. The leader spun, firing his Colt without a second's thought. The shotgun blast went wide, shattering a window, but the robber's bullet found its mark. The bank manager crumpled to the floor. In that instant of chaos, a second shot rang out. It came from the robber at the counter, whose gun had discharged accidentally as he scrambled away from the manager's shotgun blast. Nate felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his shoulder. He staggered back, crying out as he collided with Eleanor. And then he heard it. Not a scream, not a cry, but a soft, surprised sigh. He turned. Eleanor was looking at him, her eyes wide with a question she would never get to ask. A small dark stain was blossoming on the front of her pale blue dress, directly over her heart. She swayed her hand, reaching for him, and then she collapsed. No, Nate breathed the word, a hollow sound, in a world that had suddenly gone silent. He dropped to his knees beside her, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. "Eleanor, stay with me." The robbers, their heist ruined, were already backing toward the door. The leader glanced back, his icy eyes filled not with remorse, but with cold fury. In his haste, something slipped from his neck, a glint of silver falling to the floorboards, unnoticed. Nate saw none of it. He saw only Eleanor's face, her skin paling, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He pressed his hand to the wound, but it was useless. The blood was everywhere, staining his hands, her dress the floor. "Nate," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "Our ranch. We'll still have it." He promised, his voice breaking, tears blurring his vision. "I'll get you there. Just hold on." But he knew it was a lie. He could feel her life slipping away under his fingertips. Her eyes, which had held so much light and laughter, began to cloud over. She gave one last shuddering breath and was still. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight that suffocated every other sound. The ticking of the clock, the distant shouts in the street, the groans of the wounded manager, it all faded into a dull, meaningless hum. All that was real was the cold, unyielding finality of Eleanor's stillness. When the sheriff and his deputies finally stormed the bank, they found Nate still kneeling on the floor, cradling Eleanor's body, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. His own wound bled freely, but he didn't feel it. He felt nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness. Later, after the doctor had stitched his shoulder and the undertaker had taken Eleanor away, the sheriff asked him for a statement. Nate's voice was a monotone, a dead thing. He described the leader's cold eyes, the raw sound of his voice, the chilling efficiency of the attack. His testimony was the only clear account they had. He was the sole surviving witness who had gotten a good look at the man. Weeks later, they caught a drifter named Elias Thorne in a town 2 states over. He matched Nate's description and was found with a portion of the stolen money. At the trial, Nate stood before the court, his arm in a sling, his heart a hollow cavity in his chest. He looked at Elias Thorne and saw the same cold emptiness he remembered in the robber's eyes. "That's him," Nate said, his voice devoid of emotion. "That's the man who led the robbery, the man who killed her." His word was enough. Elias Thorne was convicted and hanged. Justice, they called it. But it felt like nothing. It didn't bring Eleanor back. It didn't fill the silence that now consumed Nate's life. In the aftermath, as he cleared out the bank's chaos, a deputy found something on the floor near where Eleanor had fallen. A silver locket tarnished with a small speck of blood. It was ornate, engraved with a delicate pattern of vines and a single stylized E. Assuming it was Eleanor's, the sheriff gave it to Nate. He took it, the cold metal, a small, solid piece of his grief. He never opened it. He couldn't bear to. He just kept it, a relic from the day his world ended. He bought the Morrison place with what was left of his savings and blood money from the bank's insurance. He built the ranch, not with hope, but with a grim, relentless fury. He worked until his muscles screamed and his hands bled, seeking exhaustion as a refuge from memory. The land was his penance, his fortress, his tomb. For 5 years, the silence of the vast Montana prairie was his only companion, and the ghost of a girl with a sunbeam smile haunted every sunrise. 5 years later, the storm rolled in without warning, a wild Montana squall that turned the wide prairie sky into a black curtain of wind and dust. Nate Walker leaned into the gale, his hand gripping the doorframe of his barn. The wind clawed at his buildings like a pack of wolves, and he fought it with the grim resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose but the work of his hands. The ranch was his gamble, his stubborn fight against the loneliness that had settled in his bones like a permanent chill. When the gusts finally eased, he staggered back into the house, dust coating his hair. The air inside was still and heavy with the scent of pine and old sorrows. He dropped into the oak chair at his desk, his body aching, and that's when he saw it. The letter lay waiting sealed in red wax, the Whitaker crest pressed into its face. He had read it twice already, and the words still clung to him with an uneasy weight. They were sending him a wife, Rose Whitaker. He had written to Silas Whitaker on a whim, a desperate, foolish act, born of a loneliness so profound it had begun to feel like a physical illness. He knew of Whitaker's reputation, a man whose ambition often outpaced his honor. Nate had thought vaguely that an alliance might offer insight into the man's questionable dealings. But that was a lie, he told himself. The truth was simpler and more painful. The silence of the ranch had become unbearable. The reply had come too quickly. There was no talk of dowry, no hard questions, just a short, almost eager acceptance. It didn't sit right. He leaned back, staring out the window toward the road that vanished into the rolling hills. In 2 days, a wagon would come down that road, carrying a woman who by law and promise would become his wife. He remembered her. 3 years ago at the general store, a brief, sharp memory. Silas Whitaker's daughters. Lydia arranging fabrics with practiced grace. Florence fluttering her lashes at a merchant. And then there had been Rose, the youngest, kneeling in the dirt beside a wounded dog, her dress stained with mud. Her family had treated her with a casual cruelty that had stuck with Nate. Her mother's scolding, her sister's laughter. He remembered the dismissal in her father's voice. Our youngest. But Nate had seen something else. He had watched her hands steady and gentle as she bound the dog's leg with strips torn from her own petticoat. He had seen the focused compassion in her eyes. It was not beauty that had struck him, though she had that too hidden beneath the dirt. It was courage, a quiet, stubborn honesty. It was a quality so rare it felt like a mirage, and he had remembered it for 3 years. He folded the letter. The storm had passed, but the unease remained. Why was her family so eager to send her away? Far away at the Whitaker homestead, Silas Whitaker held the same letter, a triumphant smirk on his face. His wife Eleonora sat stiff-backed beside him. A prosperous rancher, she said, her voice sharp with satisfaction. And far enough away that we'll never have to deal with her meddling again. Poor Rose. Florence chirped, her laugh empty of warmth. She won't know what's coming. She asks too many questions. Silas muttered, rubbing his temples. The Henderson contract, Judge Morrison's nephew. Each time she opens her mouth, she costs us allies. She's a curse on this family. No man wants a wife who humiliates him by speaking inconvenient truths. Eleonora snapped. This marriage solves everything. Nate Walker is a man of little talk and much land. He'll keep her busy. None of them knew that Rose stood just outside the kitchen door, her back pressed against the wall, hearing every word. The world tilted under her feet. She had always known she was different, an unwelcome note in her family's symphony of ambition. But to hear them speak of her as a burden to be discarded, it carved a wound deeper than any scolding. She slipped away, her hands trembling, and went to her grandmother's dim room. The old woman slept, her breathing shallow. Rose sank into the chair beside her, gripping the frail hand. They're sending me away, Grandmama. She whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. They think I've caused too much trouble. For 22 years she had lived in a house where affection was a currency she could not earn. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. The wagon was set to arrive Thursday. 2 days. 2 days to pack a life that felt as though it had never truly begun. And in town, from the shadows of his law office, Caleb Harlan watched. He had a keen interest in the affairs of the Whitakers, and an even keener one in Nate Walker. He had heard the whispers about the arrangement. Rose Whitaker, the girl whose inconvenient honesty had once cost him a profitable contract, was to be the wife of Nate Walker, the man whose testimony had sent his brother to the gallows. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. He had waited 5 years for this. He had moved to this territory, built a new life, and cultivated a respectable facade, all for one purpose: to dismantle Nate Walker piece by piece. He had studied his target, learning his habits, his strengths, and his profound isolating grief. He had planned to use that grief to poison it, to turn Walker's reputation to ash. And now fate had delivered him the perfect instrument. Rose Whitaker, a woman her own family called a curse. Caleb would ensure the rest of the world believed it too. He would use her to strip away everything Nate Walker held dear, just as his own family had been destroyed. Vengeance was a dish best served cold, and after 5 long years, his was about to be served. The wagon wheels creaked over the uneven prairie road, each jolt a reminder of the life Rose was leaving behind. The Montana sky stretched above her, a vast and indifferent blue. She pulled her shawl tighter, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where a new life or new kind of prison awaited her. The driver beside her was silent, for which she was grateful. Words felt like fragile, useless things. As the sun began its slow descent, the driver pointed with his whip, Walker's Land. Rose's gaze followed his gesture. Rolling pastures stretched toward a sturdy ranch house nestled against a stand of pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin, steady ribbon of gray against the evening sky. It looked solid, permanent. It was both humbling and terrifying. This was no longer a journey. It was an arrival. Inside the ranch house, Nate stood at the window, watching the dust trail rise on the distant road. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had spent 2 days scrubbing floors, chopping wood, and trying to scrub the lingering scent of solitude from the very walls. He had even placed a sprig of late-blooming lilac in a vase on the table, a clumsy gesture of welcome that now seemed hopelessly inadequate. He told himself it was foolish to be nervous. He was a man who had faced down storms and predators, who had carved a living from an unforgiving land. But this felt different. This felt like a risk his heart was not prepared for. He stepped onto the porch as the wagon pulled to a stop. Dust swirled, settling on Rose's bonnet as she lifted her face. Nate's breath caught in his throat. She was thinner than he remembered, her features sharpened by a strain he could only guess at, but her eyes were the same. Clear, searching, and far too honest for her own good. "Miss Whitaker," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He offered his hand. Rose hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, calloused, and unexpectedly gentle. "Mr. Walker," she replied, her voice quiet but unwavering. The driver unloaded her small trunk, tipped his hat, and turned the wagon back toward town. The sound of the wheels fading into the dusk left Rose with a sudden dizzying sense of finality. She was alone now, with this quiet, haunted-looking man. "Let me," Nate said, lifting her trunk as if it weighed nothing. He led her inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and stew. The furniture was plain but solid, the shelves lined with books whose spines were cracked from use, not display. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warmth that seeped into her chilled bones. "Supper's ready," Nate said, gesturing to the table. "Nothing fancy." They ate in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. Nate studied her, his gaze not appraising, but curious. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Your family spoke of you as practical, but I remember something else." Rose's spoon paused midair. "What do you mean?" 3 years ago. "The trading post," he said slowly, his eyes holding hers. "You tore strips from your own petticoat to bind a stray dog's leg. Your family mocked you for it, but you didn't stop. That isn't practical, Miss Whitaker. That's courage." Heat bloomed in Rose's cheeks. For years she had carried that memory like a brand of shame, a symbol of her inability to fit in. To hear it named as courage unsettled her more than any insult ever had. "You remember that?" she asked softly. "I remember thinking," Nate said, leaning back in his chair, "that anyone willing to ruin a fine dress to save a suffering creature was someone worth knowing." For the first time since leaving home, the knot of tension in Rose's chest loosened. A fragile, tentative hope began to unfurl within her. Perhaps she had not been invisible after all. Perhaps in some small way she had been seen. But as the firelight flickered between them, casting long shadows across the room, another shadow moved elsewhere. In town, Caleb Harlan sat in the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his mind sharp as a razor. He had seen the wagon carry Rose toward Walker's ranch. He had listened to the whispers, the hunger for gossip. "Cast out," he murmured to a pair of ranch hands, his voice laced with false sympathy. "Her own family couldn't stomach her. You have to wonder what kind of trouble she'll bring to a good man like Walker." The seeds of doubt were planted. Caleb smiled, a slow, predatory curl of his lips. Rose Whitaker did not yet know that her journey toward a new life would lead her straight into the heart of a 5-year-old vendetta, and into the arms of a man whose past was far darker and more complicated than she could ever imagine. The days that followed settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm. Rose learned the contours of Nate's life, which was shaped entirely by the demands of the land. He rose before the sun, and the sound of his boots on the floorboards, a steady, reliable beat. He moved with a relentless energy, as if he were trying to outrun a ghost that only he could see. She found her own place within that rhythm, tending the small garden, mending his worn shirts, and turning the quiet house into a space that felt less like a shelter and more like a home. They spoke little, but their silences were not empty. They were filled with observation, with the slow, careful process of two wounded people learning the shape of each other's solitude. Rose saw the deep sadness that clung to Nate like a second skin. It was in the way he would sometimes stop mid-task and stare at the horizon, his eyes lost in a memory that brought a shadow of pain to his face. He never spoke of it, and she did not ask. She knew what it was to carry a past that could not be easily shared. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry, she saw him by the corral, his back to the house. He had pulled something from his pocket. It was a silver locket glinting in the harsh sunlight. He held it for a long moment, his thumb tracing its surface, his posture slumping with a weight of grief that was almost palpable. He didn't open it. He just held it, a man communing with a ghost. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he quickly pocketed it and returned to his work, his movements once again sharp and purposeful. That evening, as they sat on the porch, the sky bleeding from orange to purple, she decided to breach the wall of his silence. "My family sent me away because my honesty was inconvenient for them," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. They saw it as a flaw. Nate stopped whittling a piece of wood. He turned his head, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "It's not a flaw." They thought it was, she continued. "I spoke up when a neighbor's contract was altered to his disadvantage. I pointed out that the banker's son was cheating at cards. Each time my father lost an opportunity or an ally, They said I was a curse on their ambitions. They were fools, Nate said, his voice a low murmur. He set down his knife. Honesty is the only thing that has any real value out here. The land doesn't care for pretty lies. It demands the truth of your strength, your sweat. It demands honesty. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. I'm not your father, Rose. I don't want a wife who bends. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. He saw her, she realized with a jolt. He saw the very quality that had made her an outcast and named it strength. In that moment, the fragile hope she had been nurturing began to feel like something more solid, something that might actually take root. Their bond deepened quietly but surely. He began to talk more, telling her about the cattle, about the way the seasons changed the land, about the father who had taught him how to read the sky. He never spoke of the woman connected to the locket, but the space her absence occupied in his life felt a little less desolate. He started to smile, small, rare things that lit up his somber face. One evening, a fierce wind kicked up, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves. A loose shutter on the barn began to bang relentlessly against the wall. Nate sighed, pushing back from the dinner table. I've got to fix that before it tears loose. I'll come with you, Rose said, already rising. In the dark, wind-whipped yard, he held the lantern while she steadied the ladder. The wind tore at her skirts and whipped her hair across her face, but she held firm, her hands gripping the wooden rungs. As he climbed, a powerful gust nearly knocked the ladder over. Rose threw her entire weight against it, her feet sliding in the mud, her voice a sharp cry of effort. Nate scrambled down his face, pale in the lantern light. Are you all right? He asked, his hands finding her shoulders. I'm fine, she said, breathless. But you almost fell. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile woman sent to him by arrangement, but a partner. Someone who stood her ground in a storm. The space between them crackled with an unspoken energy. He could smell the rain on her skin, see the fierce determination in her eyes. He leaned in, his movement slow, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His lips met hers tentatively at first, then with a deep, searching hunger that spoke of 5 years of loneliness. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and wind, and a desperate, aching need for connection. Rose responded in kind, her hands coming up to cup his jaw, her fear dissolving into a wave of feeling so powerful it left her shaking. When they broke apart, the wind seemed to quiet, as if holding its breath. Rose, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. The single word held a universe of meaning. Back in the warm, quiet house, the storm outside felt distant. The walls of their individual solitudes had finally come down. They had found in each other a refuge, a place of quiet understanding. But while love was blooming in the isolation of the ranch, a different kind of storm was gathering in town. Caleb Harlan had spent weeks cultivating his narrative. He sat in the saloon buying drinks for ranch hands and merchants, his voice a silken thread of poison. A shame about Walker, he'd say, shaking his head with feigned sadness. Fine man, hard-working. But that wife of his, they say she was cast out. Her own family. Brings a chill, doesn't it? A woman with no loyalty to her own blood. What loyalty can she have for a husband? He was a master of insinuation. He never made a direct accusation, but he planted seeds of doubt, watering them with whispers and knowing glances. He played on the fears of a small community, their suspicion of outsiders, their hunger for drama. His words found fertile ground. People began to look at Nate with pity and at Rose with suspicion. When Nate rode into town for supplies, conversations would hush. The store owner, who had once greeted him with a hearty clap on the back, now offered only a curt nod. The first real strike came a week after the storm. Nate rode out to his northern pasture to find a section of his fence cut, the wires snipped clean through. 20 head of his best cattle were gone. It was a devastating loss, one that would take him a year to recover from. When he returned to the house, his face was a grim mask of stone. Rose saw the fury and despair in his eyes, and her heart ached for him. "It was Harlan," Nate said, his voice flat and hard. "I can't prove it, but I know it." "What will you do?" she asked. "I'm going to ride into town and face him." "No, Nate," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "That's what he wants. He wants to provoke you into a fight, to make you look like a hothead. He's turning the town against you with whispers. A public brawl will only prove his point." He looked at her, his internal battle visible on his face. Her logic was sound, but the rage inside him demanded action. "So I'm supposed to do nothing? Let him steal from me, slander my wife, and get away with it?" "You don't fight him with fists," Rose said, her voice gaining strength. "You fight him with the truth. We ride into town together. We show them we are not broken. We show them we are not afraid." He studied her face, seeing the quiet courage that he had first noticed 3 years ago. She was right. Harlan's weapon was lies. Theirs had to be the truth. "All right, Rose," he said, his voice quiet. "We do it your way." As they prepared to ride out, Nate paused at his desk. He opened a small drawer and took out the silver locket. He stared at it for a moment, the polished surface reflecting his grim expression. Then, with a decisive click, he opened it for the first time in 5 years. Inside, there was no miniature portrait of Eleanor. Instead, on one side was a tiny faded photograph of a handsome young man with laughing eyes and an easy smile. On the other, the initial E was engraved. Not for Eleanor. For Elias. Elias Thorne. Nate's blood ran cold. The locket hadn't belonged to Eleanor. It had belonged to the man he had sent to the gallows. The world tilted on its axis. He had built his life, his grief, his entire identity for the last 5 years around a single defining tragedy. Now a piece of that story, a piece he had held in his hand all this time, was staring back at him, telling him he had it all wrong. He snapped the locket shut, his mind reeling. The questions were a swarm of angry bees. Why did Elias Thorne have this locket? And more importantly, how did it end up on the floor of the bank? He shoved it into his pocket at the cold metal, a burning weight against his leg. He had a confrontation to face in town, but a far more dangerous one was now raging within him. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. And it was coming for him. The ride into Miles City was taut, with a silence that felt heavier than words. Nate rode with his jaw set, his thoughts churning. The locket in his pocket was a physical manifestation of the doubt now poisoning his memory. Beside him, Rose sat tall and straight in her saddle, her expression composed, but Nate could see the tension in the way she held the reins. She was afraid not for herself, but for him, for the life they were trying to build. He felt a surge of protective anger so fierce it almost choked him. Caleb Harlan would not destroy this. Not this too. As they entered the main street, the town's reaction was immediate and palpable. Windows were parted, conversations ceased, and faces turned to watch them pass. The air was thick with judgment. It was as if Caleb's whispers had woven an invisible shroud over the town, and they were riding directly into it. They found him where they knew he would be holding court, on the boardwalk outside the saloon. He was leaning against a post, a picture of casual confidence, surrounded by a small group of men who hung on his every word. His suit was immaculate, a stark contrast to the dusty work clothes of the ranchers and merchants around him. He saw them approach, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He didn't wait for Nate to speak. "Ah, Walker," he called out, his voice carrying across the street, smooth and laced with condescension. "And his blushing bride. Come to grace us with your presence. I was just telling these good men how unfortunate it is when a man's judgment is clouded. You build a fine ranch, work yourself to the bone, and then you make one poor choice, and it all starts to unravel." His gaze flicked to Rose, his eyes lingering with a calculated insult. Some things, like a bad reputation, have a way of following a person. Nate swung down from his horse, his movement stiff with controlled rage. Rose dismounted beside him, her hand briefly touching his back in a silent message of support. "My wife's reputation is not your concern," Harlan, Nate said, his voice low and dangerous. Caleb chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Oh, but it is. It's the town's concern. When your fences are cut and your cattle go missing, we all wonder. Is it bad luck, or is it something you brought upon yourself? A man's fortunes are tied to the company he keeps. You brought a curse into your home, Walker, and now it's starting to fester." A murmur went through the crowd. Caleb had expertly framed the sabotage not as a crime against Nate, but as a threat to the community's stability. Rose felt the sting of 100 pairs of eyes. For a moment, the old shame, the familiar feeling of being the unwanted, the accused, threatened to overwhelm her. She could feel the weight of her family's verdict pressing down on her. A curse, trouble, cast out. Then she felt Nate's presence beside her, solid and unwavering. He hadn't flinched. He was her anchor in this storm of lies. And she found her voice. "You speak of curses, Mr. Harlan," she said, her tone clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs. "But the only curse I see here is the poison of your words. You spin lies to turn neighbor against neighbor because you thrive on discord. It is the tool of a man with no honor." Caleb's smile tightened. He had not expected her to speak, let alone with such force. Strong words from a woman her own family sent away. "Yes, they did," Rose said, her chin lifting. "They sent me away because I refused to be silent about their dishonest dealings, because I valued truth more than their comfort. They cast me out not for my weakness, but for a strength they could not control. I will not apologize for it. Not to them, and certainly not to you." The crowd shifted. Her words, delivered with such plain-spoken dignity, had an undeniable ring of truth. Doubt began to flicker on the faces of the men who had been listening so raptly to Caleb. Nate stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Rose. "My fence was cut last night. 20 head of cattle were stolen." He looked directly at Caleb, his eyes like chips of flint. "You seem to know a lot about my bad luck, Harlan. Almost as if you were there to see it happen." It was a direct accusation, and it hung in the air like a loaded gun. Caleb's facade of smooth confidence finally cracked. A flicker of raw hatred showed in his eyes. "That's a serious charge, Walker. You have no proof." "I have the proof of your character," Nate shot back. "You're a man who uses whispers and shadows. You came to this town and built a reputation on slick words, but there's nothing solid underneath. You attacked my ranch, and you tried to blame my wife because you're a coward." The word hung in the air. Coward. In this world, it was the ultimate condemnation. Caleb's hand twitched toward the pistol holstered at his hip, but he stopped himself. He was a lawyer, a manipulator. A gunfight was not his arena. He had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. "You'll regret this, Walker," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. He turned on his heel and stalked into the saloon, the swing doors flapping shut behind him. The crowd began to disperse, the men talking in low tones, their expressions now thoughtful, suspicious. A few of them met Nate's eyes and gave him a slow, respectful nod. They had seen the truth. They had seen a man and a woman standing together, unbowed against a campaign of slander. As they mounted their horses to leave the town, Sheriff stepped forward. "Nate," he said quietly, "I'll ride out with a few men and look for tracks around that broken fence. Can't promise anything, but we'll look." It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The tide had turned. The ride back to the ranch was different. The tension had been replaced by a quiet sense of solidarity. They had faced the fire together and had not been burned. When they reached the house, Nate turned to Rose, his expression serious. "Thank you," he said. "I would have handled that badly without you." "We handled it together," she corrected gently. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "Rose, what we have. It's real. I want you to know that." A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of belonging so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. She leaned in and kissed him a kiss of gratitude, of partnership, of love that had been tested and had proven true. Later that night, as Rose slept, Nate sat at the desk, the lantern casting a pool of golden light on the wood. He took out the silver locket. The questions it had raised still tormented him. He stared at the face of the smiling young man inside. Elias Thorne, the man he had condemned to death. His testimony had been based on the coldness in the man's eyes, a trait he shared with the bank robber. But was that enough? Had his grief and rage made him see a likeness that wasn't truly there? Had he sent an innocent man to the gallows? The thought was a cold, sickening weight in the pit of his stomach. And what was the connection to Eleanor? Why would the man who supposedly murdered her be carrying a locket with his own picture in it? It made no sense. Unless the story he had told himself for 5 years was a lie. He remembered Caleb's hatred, the personal venom in his voice. It wasn't just about the ranch or Rose. It was about him. "You'll regret this, Walker." It was a promise, a vendetta. Could Caleb Harlan be connected to Elias Thorne, a brother, a cousin? The possibility sent a chill down his spine. If that were true, then every act of sabotage, every whisper, every lie, was part of a calculated, long-simmering revenge. Nate closed his hand around the locket, the metal digging into his palm. He had won the battle in town today, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the war was far from over. Caleb Harlan was not a man who would accept defeat. He would escalate. He would come for everything Nate held dear. And the final confrontation would not be fought with words, but with blood and fire. The first flakes of snow began to fall just after dawn, small and hesitant at first, then larger and more determined, sticking to the frozen ground. By noon, the world outside the ranch house had been transformed into a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, piling drifts against the barn and rattling the window panes. It was a blizzard, the kind that isolated, that erased roads and landmarks, that forced a reckoning with whatever was trapped inside with you. Nate spent the morning securing the livestock, his face raw from the wind, his mind a turbulent storm that mirrored the one outside. The revelation of the locket had unsettled him to his core. Every quiet moment was filled with the ghost of Elias Thorne and the gnawing question of his own culpability. He kept glancing toward the road, an inexplicable sense of dread tightening his gut. Rose worked beside him, her movements efficient and calm, a steady presence in the chaos. She seemed to sense his distraction, her quiet glances conveying a concern she didn't voice. By early afternoon, they were sealed inside the house, the fire roaring in the hearth, the world outside rendered invisible by the thick curtain of snow. "No one is going anywhere for a few days," Rose said, ladling hot soup into bowls. The simple domestic act felt like a fragile shield against the fury of the storm. "Good," Nate said, trying to force a reassuring smile. "Means we're safe." But he didn't feel safe. He felt like a man in a besieged fortress, waiting for the enemy to breach the walls. The attack came just as twilight began to bleed its gray gloom into the white landscape. It started not with a bang, but with a smell. Acrid smoke, sharp and unnatural, tainting the clean scent of wood smoke from the hearth. "What is that?" Rose asked, her head lifting. Nate was already on his feet, his senses screaming. He threw open the door. The wind and snow blasted into the room, but through the maelstrom he could see it. An angry orange glow flickering against the side of the barn, feeding on the dry timber growing with every gust of wind. "The barn's on fire," he said, his voice a low, horrified whisper. His first thought was of the horses trapped in their stalls. He grabbed his heaviest coat and a rifle from the rack by the door. "Stay here, call for help if you can, though no one will hear in this." "Nate, no," Rose cried, grabbing his arm. "You can't go out there alone. The roof could collapse." "The horses will burn alive. I have to try." He pulled away from her, his face a mask of grim determination, and plunged into the blizzard. The wind was a physical force, driving icy pellets into his face, stealing his breath. The smoke was thicker now, a choking black cloud that made his eyes water. He fought his way toward the barn, the roar of the fire, and the wind a deafening chorus in his ears. The large barn doors were already engulfed in flames. He ran to the smaller side door, kicked it open, and was met with a wall of heat and smoke. Inside was a vision of hell. Flames licked up the walls and across the hayloft. The terrified screams of the horses were a sound of pure agony. He pulled his bandana over his face and charged in his lungs, burning. He worked frantically, unlatching the stalls, slapping the panicked animals on their rumps, driving them out the door and into the relative safety of the snow-filled corral. He had just freed the last horse when a section of the hayloft, heavy with burning hay, groaned ominously above him. He scrambled back just as it crashed down, sending a shower of embers and flaming debris across the floor where he had just been standing. He staggered out of the barn, coughing, his clothes singed, his heart pounding. The horses were safe, but the barn, the structure he had built with his own hands, was being devoured. And then he heard it. A sound that chilled him more than the blizzard's wind. A scream. It was Rose's voice, sharp with terror, coming not from the house, but from near the burning barn. He spun around, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene, and he saw them. Two figures struggling in the snow near the corner of the barn that was not yet fully ablaze. One was Rose. The other, holding her fast, was Caleb Harlan. Rage, pure and blinding, surged through Nate. He raised his rifle, but the swirling snow and flickering firelight made a clean shot impossible. He started running, his boots sinking deep in the drifts, his shouts lost in the wind. Caleb saw him coming. He dragged Rose backward toward the intact section of the barn. "Stay back, Walker," he yelled, his voice thin but clear against the storm's howl. "Or she dies with the rest of your pathetic life." He forced Rose through the side door and into the burning structure. Nate's blood ran cold. He knew what Caleb intended. It wasn't enough to burn his barn. He wanted to burn his heart, to inflict the maximum possible pain. Nate didn't hesitate. He followed them in the rifle held ready. Inside, the heat was suffocating. Smoke swirled, creating monstrous dancing shadows. He saw Caleb backing into a corner, using Rose as a shield, a pistol now gleaming in his hand. "You wanted a reckoning, Walker," Caleb screamed over the roar of the flames. "Here it is." "Let her go, Harlan." Nate growled, advancing slowly, his rifle trained on Caleb's head. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it was always between you and me." Caleb laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "From the moment your testimony sent my brother to the gallows." The words hit Nate like a physical blow. He froze, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Caleb's vendetta, the locket, Elias Thorne. He was your brother. My older brother, Caleb, spat, his face contorted with 5 years of hatred. A good man, an honest man, until you, the sole surviving witness, pointed your finger and swore his life away. You destroyed my family, Walker. You took everything from me. A massive beam overhead creaked, groaning under the fire's assault. Embers rained down around them. He was a robber, a killer. Nate yelled back, his own certainty shaking. He was set up. Caleb shrieked. He was just a drifter who fit a vague description. You were so blinded by your own grief, you needed someone to blame, and you chose him. My brother died with your lie around his neck. He shoved Rose forward, and in that moment of distraction, he fired his pistol. The bullet whizzed past Nate's ears, splintering the wooden stall behind him. Nate fired back, not to kill, but to disarm. His shot hit Caleb's arm, and the pistol clattered to the floor. Caleb cried out in pain, clutching his wounded arm. He glared at Nate, his eyes burning with a mad fire. You think you've won. You still don't know the whole truth, do you? The truth about your precious sainted Eleanor. Leave her out of this, Nate roared, advancing on him. I can't. Caleb laughed, a broken, desperate sound. She was the heart of it all. Why do you think Elias was in that town? Why do you think he had a locket with his initial on it? It wasn't his. It was hers. She gave it to him. Nate stopped dead, the world narrowing to Caleb's hate-filled face and the roaring flames around them. What are you talking about? Your Eleanor wasn't an innocent victim, you fool. Where Caleb spat out the words like venom. She was an accomplice. She was in on the robbery. She and Elias were lovers. They were going to take that money, your money, and run away together. Her death was an accident, a stray bullet from one of her own partners, but her betrayal was planned down to the last dollar. The secondary twist hit Nate with the force of a physical collapse. His memory, his grief, and the entire foundation of his last 5 years crumbled into ash. Eleanor, a betrayer, a thief. The life he thought had been stolen from him had been a lie all along. The pain was a new and profound agony, sharper than any bullet wound. He saw Rose looking at him, her face filled with shock and a deep, aching compassion. Her presence anchored him, pulled him back from the abyss of the past. The barn groaned, the main support beam directly above them, beginning to splinter and sag. Nate, we have to get out, Rose screamed. Caleb, seeing his last chance, lunged for his fallen pistol. But Nate was faster. He tackled him, driving him hard against a support post. The impact shook the already unstable structure. It's over, Caleb, Nate said, his voice raw with grief and exhaustion. Not until you're destroyed. Caleb snarled, his good hand, reaching for a pitchfork leaning against the wall. He swung it wildly. Nate dodged, but the tines caught his coat, tearing the fabric. As they struggled, the main beam finally gave way. With a sound like the world splitting apart, it crashed down, bringing a cascade of fire and timber with it. Nate threw himself backward, pulling Rose with him, shielding her with his body as they scrambled toward the door. They tumbled out into the snow, gasping for air, just as the entire roof of the barn collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a fountain of sparks and fire into the blizzard-swept sky. Nate pushed himself to his feet, his eyes wild, searching the inferno. Caleb. There was no answer. Only the hungry crackle of the flames consuming what was left of the barn and what was left of Caleb Harlan. He was gone, consumed by the very fire he had set a final violent end to his long and twisted path of vengeance. Nate stood there, the snow and ash swirling around him, the heat of the fire on his face, the cold of the truth in his heart. His barn was gone. His past was a lie. Eleanor, the angel of his memory, was a ghost, built on deceit. He looked at Rose, her face streaked with soot, her eyes filled with a strength that held him together. She was all that was left. She was the only thing that was real. The fire raged on a funeral pyre for a barn for a man and for a 5-year-long lie. And in the ruins surrounded by the storm, Nate Walker knew that his life, the real one, was only just beginning. The blizzard blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world of profound silence and blinding white. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the rising sun cast long, sharp shadows across the snow-covered land. Where the barn had once stood, a blackened, skeletal frame smoked against the snow, a grim monument to the night's violence. Nate and Rose stood on the porch of the small ranch house, wrapped in blankets, mugs of coffee steaming in their hands. They hadn't slept. They had spent the hours after the fire tending to Nate's minor burns and simply sitting in the quiet, the magnitude of the revelations settling between them. Nate stared at the ruins, his face a mask of exhaustion. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. "Everything I did for 5 years," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Building this place, working until I couldn't stand. I thought I was honoring her memory. But I was honoring a lie." Rose moved closer, her shoulder pressing against his. "You were honoring your own grief, Nate. That was real. The pain you felt was real. Her betrayal doesn't change that." He shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "I sent a man to the gallows. An innocent man. Or at least not the man I thought he was. I built this entire life on a foundation of vengeance and lies." "No," Rose said firmly, turning to face him. She took the mug from his hand and set it aside, taking his hands in hers. "You built this life with your own strength, with your sweat and your decency. The reasons you started may have been flawed, but what you created here is real, and it is good. It's yours. It's ours." Her clarity cut through his confusion. She wasn't judging him. She wasn't recoiling from the ugly truth of his past. She was seeing him, the man standing before her now, and offering him a way forward. He looked down at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and felt a profound wave of gratitude. "What did I ever do to deserve you?" he whispered. "You saw me," she replied simply, "when no one else did." Later that day, the sheriff and 2 deputies finally made it through the snow-clogged roads. Nate told them everything. He told them about Caleb's confession about his relation to Elias Thorne, about the fire. Hidden in the charred debris, they found what was left of Caleb's body and the pistol he had used. The story was wild, but the evidence supported it. Miles City would know Caleb Harlan not as a respectable lawyer, but as an arsonist driven by a twisted quest for revenge. The truth about Eleanor, however, Nate kept for himself. It was a private ghost, a story that would serve no purpose to share. It belonged to the past. A week later, after the snow had begun to melt, Nate hitched a wagon. He said nothing to Rose about where he was going, but she seemed to understand. He drove the long miles to the town cemetery, the air crisp and clean smelling of thawed earth and new beginnings. Eleanor's grave was marked by an ornate, expensive headstone he had commissioned years ago. "Beloved Eleanor, taken too soon." The words mocked him now. He had built a monument to a fantasy. He worked for over an hour, his muscles straining as he dislodged the heavy stone, loading it onto the back of the wagon. the marble was cold and impersonal. It had nothing to do with the flawed human girl who had lied to him. From the back of the wagon, he took out a simple wooden cross he had made himself. The wood was plain sanded smooth by his own hands. He drove it firmly into the soil at the head of the grave. It was not a gesture of condemnation, but of acceptance. He was letting go of the angel he had created in his grief and forgiving the woman who had actually lived. As he stood back, a shadow fell beside his. He turned to see Rose standing there. She had followed him. She didn't speak, just slipped her hand into his. He looked at the simple cross, then at her. "It's over," he said, the words feeling true for the first time. "No," she said softly, a small smile touching her lips. "It's just beginning." He squeezed her hand, a feeling of peace settling over him, quiet and deep. He turned his back on the grave, on the ornate headstone lying in the wagon, on the ghost of a life that never was. He walked with Rose hand in hand, away from the silent stones and toward the open, endless horizon. The ranch was waiting. A new barn needed to be built, fences needed to be mended, and a life one built not on a romanticized tragedy, but on the solid ground of truth and shared strength was waiting to be lived.